myself. There we go. I'm going to unmute myself. I'm just talking to myself. So when I say, hey, I'm going to unmute, we are going to introduce our speakers in just a moment. I wanted first, before I introduce Julie, I am going to introduce Angela Durante. She was the first person on the video, if you happen to get in right at the beginning of the video. CCL is her dream and her vision, and I met her way back in, I believe it was August or September, when I was looking for something new. I joined a learning pod Zoom and she was on there and I clicked. So Angela Durante is going to be our moderator, and we'll be asking our speakers, our keynote speakers, various questions after they've spoken, after the 15 minutes that they've spoken, and then we're going to have a little bit of a panel chat. So she will moderate the questions and ask our speakers. So before I turn it over to Julie, let me introduce Julie next. And Julie, Dr. Julie Ponesse has a PhD in philosophy, in ethics, and many of you will have seen her viral video that has, gone crazy across the internet. And when she was doing their video in the fall of last year, many of us, myself included, were going through the exact same challenge that she was. We were being told by our institutions that we were no longer good enough for them because of our choices. And when I saw Julie's video, I said to my mom, I called her up, I said, hey mom, there's someone else out there who thinks like me. I was so happy that I was not alone. And I met Julie as well a few weeks ago when she was speaking with the Democracy Fund. And she was interviewing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And what an amazing person. You've seen her paintings on the video that Jeff Graham made with the music and everything. An amazing person. So I'm going to turn it over to Julie to take us through the next few minutes and talk about revamping higher education. So I will stop sharing now so that you can focus on Julie.
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Good. Okay. Well, as Jennifer said, I'm sure that many, if not most of you here share the same story that I experienced. And for those of you who don't know, I mean, I taught philosophy at Western for about 8 years, and then at other universities in Canada and the States for about 12 years before that, until last September when I was terminated with cause for refusing to comply with and then also publicly challenging Western's COVID policy. They didn't so much like the idea that I was making public what was going on within our department, within our college. And what should have been a personal medical choice, and what's more than that, within the walls of a university, an open rational discussion with my department and administration resulted in this very public termination. But I wanted to back up a little bit and tell you a little bit more about my background, because I think it's what leads me to be quite concerned about what's going on now, not just with respect to COVID, but to put it very sort of succinctly and in sort of a non-technical way, what in the world is going on in people's brains these days, right? What's going on? So I have a PhD in philosophy, and philosophy, as many of you probably know, at its core is defined by reason and critical thinking. And so in philosophy, we use the tools of logic and reason to explore the big questions in life, the big sexy questions that everybody wants to talk about in Philosophy 101, about existence, knowledge, truth, the mind, morality, science, all of these things. But in my mind, to explore a question, any question, is to assume a stance of humility. So you have to assume that there's an answer you might not yet have, that there's an answer, or that the answer we currently have could benefit from finessing, and that there are questions we aren't currently asking that would be better to ask. And all of that requires a kind of humbleness, I think. The hallmark of critical thought, and this is not a popular idea now, but it's independent thought, right? It assumes the possibility of scrutinizing what we see, pulling it out of the public space, presenting it to our own minds, and then reaching a decision that might be contrary to what others are doing, what we're told to do, what might be the easiest to do, the path of least resistance. And some people are better at this than others, and that's a much bigger issue. But the important point, I think, is that there is value in individuals doing this, not just for ourselves, not just for reasons of autonomy and personal identity, but for everyone, but for the whole human race. And this, I think, is exactly what's being threatened today, not just in society, in media, in government, but most strikingly and horrifically in our institutions of higher learning. You know that parental rhetorical question, so if everyone jumped off a cliff, would you do it too? Well, it turns out that most of us would, at a rate of about 90% or 90 some percent. And what was, you know, humorously, what was supposed to be a cautionary rhetorical joke has become really the modus operandi of the Western world. So to go back to critical thinking for a minute, what critical thinking is supposed to do is give you the ability to look at that cliff and the reasons for jumping and the consequences for those who jump, and think about whether or not there are safer alternatives with more effective outcomes. And it might turn out that maybe jumping is the best idea. Maybe there's a tornado or a fire or an academic eating politician coming your way, you know, but it might also be rational to hold on, sit on the bench beside the cliff for a while, look at what happens to those who jump, seek other opinions, and brainstorm some alternatives, right? This is what critical thinking is supposed to do. And I know that's kind of a silly example, but I think that is on a very large scale what is happening today. And to talk about the mandates for a minute, I mean, what they do and the way they have been imposed assume without evidence or evaluation or scrutiny or revision, not only that there is no better choice than jumping, but that there is harm in wanting to deliberate about whether or not that is the best choice. And that, in my mind, is a symptom of a much deeper problem that I guess I didn't really realize this until a couple of years ago, but I think has been brewing in our culture and in academia for a very long time. And seems to be a kind of paradigm shift away from objective truth and true, genuine, open discourse towards an approach to thinking and treating each other that is, I believe, illogical, exclusionary, and eminently unscientific. To give you a little anecdote, I had a bit of a row with David Fissman on Twitter yesterday. I don't know if you know David Fissman, but we ended up having an exchange that involved more emojis than it did words. You know, I mean, this is what academics are doing these days. And this is not try to elevate the conversation, and it just gets bogged down by these kinds of weights. And I think the Center for Learning has the ability to move beyond that, move away from that. But I don't want to, you know, get too bogged down in the mandates or COVID specifically today. What I really want to do is talk about the value of critical thinking, why civilizations were built on it, and what a liberal arts education is and why it still matters. I remember, I don't know how many of you will have seen this, but when I was a first year undergraduate, I remember coming across a comic that had a number of people standing in an unemployment line, and the only they wrote something on the back of one of the shirts, and the only one that was visible was philosopher, right? So there is this kind of joke, but I think jokes aside, jokes are funny for a reason. It's because they pick up on a salient idea in society, which is that the liberal arts, which we now think of specifically as things like literature, history, philosophy, music, but which traditionally are much more broadly part of a classical education, we think that they're liberal because they're somehow loose or easygoing or subjective. And the assumption, I think, in our science-based culture is that the liberal arts lack a kind of crisp-edged precision or objectivity, that they are free of mathematics. And so we dismiss them as having anything useful to say in times of crisis. And we have unmoored science from its association with all other disciplines that help to give it a sense of scope and purpose and meaning. But to take us way back, you know, the liberal arts had their origins in ancient Greece, where education starts with a desire for understanding. And the philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras argued that there is, I mean, this is a time when you could be both a philosopher and a mathematician, right? Pythagoras argued that there is mathematical harmony to the universe, and his followers linked the four arts of astronomy, mathematics, geometry, and music into one area of study to form the medieval quadrivium. And in 4th century Athens, the government respected the ability of rhetoric or public speaking above almost everything else. And eventually rhetoric, grammar, and logic were added to Pythagoras's four arts to become the seven liberal arts. Interestingly, I think 6 of these are distinctly mathematical in nature. So astronomy is really visible geometry, music is audible arithmetic, and even grammar and logic have a certain arithmetic quality to them since they are concerned with proportion and balance and pattern. But I'm not sure it's mathematics itself that made these disciplines worthy of a place in the classical curriculum. What made them valuable is that they helped people to develop their minds in ways that would enable them to become valuable members of society. And in fact, the term liberal arts is the root of the term is the idea that they were liberalis or worthy of a free person, as opposed to the servile arts that were appropriate only for slaves. So they were essential for a free person to be able to take an active part in civic life, which included participating in public debate, defending oneself in court, as Socrates had to do, serving on juries, participating in military service, and just debating in the public square. I could go on and on about how the liberal arts became the focus of education in the medieval period, but I think the point is that for millennia, an approach to education based in thinking critically about how to live a good life and how to make oneself a valuable member of society was the singular purpose of education. And if it failed at that, it was pointless. What I see in society and education now is a dominance, not just of science, but a particular concept of science that it is displacing everything else. And we have become convinced that science is the grand organizing principle for everything, that all other fields are derivative, and most alarmingly, that only those deemed expert scientists are entitled to contribute. And we now have a whole fact checker industry that has emerged to efficiently identify and excise those who stray beyond acceptable limits for intellectual and the synonym for that is scientific, and the synonym for that is a very narrow view of science discourse, right? So like Orwell's Ministry of Truth, the industry is building impermeable walls that prescribe a very narrow range of where your opinion is allowed to fall on lockdowns, masks, mRNA vaccines, gender, race, and probably everything else relevant to living a human life. So within the limits of acceptable discourse firmly being built, we're creating an intellectual echo chamber in which it is acceptable, even advisable and laudatory to decide without thinking, to talk without listening, and to cancel without apologizing. I think a return to and a genuine focus on the liberal arts, very broadly construed, can actually rescue us from this chamber. And I want to leave you with 4 things that I think a return to that view of education can do for us. The first one is that it can encourage us to embrace curiosity and complexity. When did you hear these words used in the last couple of years? And on the topic of curiosity, being willing to be stunned by questions like Socrates was, I mentioned Socrates earlier, and allowing curiosity to take a hold of you and suspend you in that state of uncertainty, in that gray area between black and white, where you don't necessarily know the answer to something, but you're willing to wait until it develops, until it evolves. Secondly, be skeptical. Question, review before accepting. Don't fall prey to the fallacy of blindly accepting advice of authorities. And I think Candace was exactly right that we have trained students to be good parrots now. And that is a very different thing from training them to be good, skeptical, critical thinkers. The third thing I think liberal arts can do for us is encourage us to be humble. And that doesn't mean being weak or loose or lacking in opinion, but it encourages us to ask, did I make any mistakes? Could I have decided or approached or researched that better? Should I rethink the way I handled that? Should I rethink who I am, who I'm becoming, who I can become? And then finally, in the educational context, being a teacher of liberal arts and critical thinking is about being inspirational, right? It's not just about doing these things ourselves or for ourselves, but about inspiring other people ultimately to trust their judgments in the pursuit of the truth, even when, especially when their endpoints diverge from our own. And, there are many things I thought I was doing when I was a philosophy instructor, but the particular questions, the particular answers we got were never as important as promoting discussion and engagement and listening. And I think there is a real void for that kind of education in society. And I think that the Learning Center can do this for us. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Julie. We have so appreciated you as a beacon in our country and more widely. You're amazing and your voice is so needed. But I can't let you off with an easy question because I know you can take it. So I would like to know what you think. What should freedom of speech look like in higher education?
Well, this is a very hot topic these days, and even people who agree with me about many other things do not agree with me about this. But I think that freedom of speech is always more important than preventing hate speech of any kind. I think we will always do better as a society to allow and promote people thinking their own thoughts and speaking their own minds. And very interestingly, the philosopher John Stuart Mill, who is known for being a utilitarian, and collectivists often refer to him, he was very much in defense of freedom of expression. And he said, the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it robs the human race. If the opinion is right, then we're deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. And if wrong, we lose the clearer perception and the livelier impression of truth. And so I don't think there's ever a reason. I think that any argument against freedom of speech and freedom of expression is going to have to be very rigorous, and the conclusion of that argument should not be accepted without very careful scrutiny. And again, that's where developing critical thinking comes in. And I don't preclude the possibility that there is such an argument, but we need to look at it very carefully.
Thanks very much, Julie. We'll come back to you when we get to our panel portion.